The day my own son threw me out of the house, I had spent 40 years paying for. He smiled. He held the keys in his hand and said, "This isn't your home anymore, Mom." I walked away with one suitcase. No money, no family, and nowhere to go. He thought the story was over. He had no idea that 7 days later, I would return, not alone and not empty-handed. By the time I stepped back through that front door, his smile had disappeared forever. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, what would you do if your own child forced you out of your home? Now, here's what really happened. Title: My son forced me out of my own house. He never expected my return. Hook 00045. The day my own son threw me out of the house, I had spent 40 years paying for. He smiled. He held the keys in his hand and said, "This isn't your home anymore, Mom." I walked away with one suitcase. No money, no family, and nowhere to go. He thought the story was over. He had no idea that 7 days later, I would return, not alone and not empty-handed. By the time I stepped back through that front door, his smile had disappeared forever. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, what would you do if your own child forced you out of your home? Now, here's what really happened. My name is Helen Carter. I'm 68 years old. Every brick in that house carried a memory. My late husband and I bought it when we were 26. We painted every wall ourselves, raised our only son, Daniel, inside those rooms. When my husband died, Daniel became my entire world. I trusted him with everything. When he offered to help manage my finances, I said yes without hesitation. For months, he handled my bills, my paperwork, even my property taxes. I never imagined he was preparing something else. One Friday morning, Daniel walked into my kitchen wearing a sharp suit. Behind him stood two strangers, a real estate agent and a man carrying legal documents. Daniel looked at me calmly. "Mom, you need to pack." I laughed. "Pack for what?" He slid a folder across the table. "I own the house now." I opened the papers. My hands began to shake. The deed had been transferred. My signature was there, but I had never signed it. I looked at my son. "What have you done?" He didn't answer. Instead, he said, "You'll be happier in assisted living." My heart broke, not because I was losing my house, but because I realized I had already lost my son. I left my home with one small suitcase, 42 years of memories, reduced to a few clothes, and a framed photograph of my husband. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't heartbroken, but because I was completely numb. I checked into a small roadside motel. The room was cold. The bed squeaked every time I moved. That night, I stared at the ceiling for hours. I kept asking myself one question. Where did I fail as a mother? Had I loved Daniel too much? Or had I simply trusted him too much? The next morning, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a name I hadn't seen in years. Richard Hayes, my husband's best friend, and the attorney who had helped us buy our first home decades ago. "Helen," he said, "I've been trying to reach you." My voice trembled. "Richard, it's over. I've lost everything." There was a long silence. Then he quietly replied, "No, I don't think you have." An hour later, we met at his office. He placed a thick file on the desk. "Helen, before your husband passed away, he asked me to keep these documents safe." I frowned. "What documents?" Richard smiled gently. He said, "Only give these to Helen if someone ever forces her out of her own home." My heart skipped. I slowly opened the folder. Inside was my husband's handwritten letter, and beneath it, several legal documents. Richard adjusted his glasses. "Helen, your husband was a very careful man. He suspected that someone might one day try to manipulate you." I looked at him in disbelief. "You mean he planned for this?" Richard nodded. "He hoped this day would never come. but he made sure you would never be defenseless. Then he pulled out one final document. It was stamped, notarized, perfectly preserved. Helen, this changes everything. I looked at him. What is it? Richard smiled. It's proof that your son never legally became the owner of your house. Tears filled my eyes. So, I can go home? Richard leaned back in his chair. Not today, but very soon. First, we're going to let Daniel believe he's won. And then, we're going to show him the truth. For the first time since leaving my home, I smiled. Because I realized my story wasn't over. It was only beginning. 3 days later, Richard called me. It's time. We drove toward my house in complete silence. As we turned onto my old street, my heart began to race. The lawn looked different. The flower beds my husband had planted were gone. The front door had been painted black. It no longer felt like home. But I wasn't there to remember the past. I was there to reclaim the truth. A moving truck sat in the driveway. Workers were unloading furniture. A young couple stood on the porch. They smiled politely when they saw us. Then, Daniel stepped outside. The moment he saw me, he laughed. Mom, I thought I made myself clear. You don't live here anymore. I calmly looked at him. I didn't come alone. Richard stepped forward. My name is Richard Hayes. I'm Mrs. Carter's attorney. Daniel rolled his eyes. It doesn't matter. The house is mine. Richard smiled. Are you sure about that? The buyers looked confused. What's going on? Richard opened his briefcase. He carefully removed a sealed envelope. Across the front, in my late husband's handwriting, were the words, "Open only if anyone attempts to take Helen's home." Daniel's smile faded. Richard opened the envelope. Inside was the original property trust. He handed copies to everyone. The property was placed into an irrevocable family trust 12 years ago. The trust clearly states, no sale, no transfer, and no change of ownership can ever happen without Helen Carter's written approval and the trustee's signature. Richard held up the papers. My signature is not on your documents. He then placed another report on the table. A forensic handwriting expert examined Helen's signature. It was forged. The young couple stepped back. You mean we never legally bought this house? Richard nodded. I'm afraid not. The sale is legally void. The real estate agent covered her mouth. Oh my God. She turned to Daniel. You told us everything was legitimate. Daniel couldn't speak. His face turned pale. Just then, his phone rang. He answered. Within seconds, his expression changed completely. The bank has frozen the sale proceeds pending investigation. His voice shook. My business loan? Another pause. Then, they canceled it. Everything he had worked toward vanished in a single moment. He looked at me, not with anger, but with fear. Mom, I'm sorry. I looked into his eyes and quietly replied, the day you forced me out of my own home, you didn't lose a house. You lost your mother's trust. The entire front yard fell silent. No one said a word. The buyers quietly walked away. The real estate agent canceled the sale. The movers loaded everything back onto the truck. Within an hour, the house was empty again, just as it had been before Daniel tried to steal it. The investigation moved quickly. The forged documents were confirmed. The property transfer was declared invalid. Because Daniel admitted what he had done and cooperated with the investigation, the court gave him probation, ordered him to repay the financial losses, and required community service instead of prison. He lost his business. His investors walked away. His reputation disappeared almost overnight. For the first time in his life, money couldn't solve his problems. 6 months later, I was sitting on the front porch, watching the sunset. There was a soft knock at the gate. When I looked up, I barely recognized him. Daniel's expensive suits were gone. His luxury watch had disappeared. He carried only one small backpack. He looked tired, Older. Broken. He slowly walked toward me. Mom, I don't expect you to forgive me. I only came to say I was wrong. He placed something on the porch. It was the old house key. The same key he had taken from me. Alongside it was a folded letter. I wrote this every night for the past 6 months. I wasn't brave enough to send it. I opened it. The first sentence made my eyes fill with tears. I spent my whole life trying to inherit your house, when I should have been trying to inherit your kindness. I kept reading. Dad spent his life building a home, and I nearly destroyed our family chasing money. If I never earn your trust again, I'll understand. But I promise I'll spend the rest of my life becoming the son you deserved. I looked at Daniel. He wasn't asking for money. He wasn't asking for the house. He wasn't asking for the company. He was asking for another chance. I stood up, walked toward him, and hugged him for several seconds. Neither of us spoke. Then I whispered, "I forgive you." He began crying. "I'm so sorry, Mom." I gently pulled back and looked him in the eyes. Forgiveness is free, but trust has to be earned. He nodded. I know, and I'll earn it. A year later, our family looked very different. Daniel never asked for ownership of the house again. Instead, every Saturday morning, he came over with coffee. He repaired the fence, trimmed the garden, painted the porch. Not because anyone told him to. Because he finally understood. A home isn't something you own. It's something you care for. Above the fireplace, I framed one sentence from my late husband's final letter. The richest people aren't the ones who own the most. They're the ones who never lose their character. Every time Daniel walked into the living room, he stopped and read those words. Not because he had to. Because they reminded him of the greatest lesson of his life. He had forced his own mother out of her home. He thought he had won. But in the end, he discovered the most valuable things in life can never be stolen.